It started quietly. At first, Earth noticed only a small delay in messages from the colonies on the outer planets. They were usually busy places, full of life and work, and delays were common. Sometimes storms or technical glitches would disrupt communications. But this time, something felt different. The silence was too long. The messages that eventually came back were garbled, broken, and filled with fear. Though the words themselves were almost gone, people in the command centers on Earth stared at the screens in disbelief. There were no signs of life. Entire colonies, places where families had lived for decades, simply stopped existing. Ships sent to investigate reported strange anomalies. Buildings were gone, infrastructure destroyed, and the few signals that survived hinted at panic, chaos, and terror. It wasn't an accident. It was deliberate. The first official response from the government tried to calm the public. They called it a technical failure, a rare cosmic storm, something explainable. But ordinary citizens didn't believe it. They had grown up listening to stories of Earth's children spreading among the stars, of people building homes, schools, and cities on planets once considered barren. And now, almost all of them were gone. The news spread like wildfire. Families begged for answers. Friends looked at each other with disbelief. Something dark had touched humanity, and the world had no way to fight back yet. People began to search for clues themselves. Amateur astronomers, engineers, and even hobbyist pilots tracked the old signals. What they discovered was chilling. Patterns emerged from the ruins' flight paths, weapon signatures, and destruction sites that made it clear the attacks were not random. Someone or something had calculated every step. They knew exactly where humanity had settled, how they communicated, and how to strike with deadly efficiency. Panic slowly turned into a feeling far worse fear. But fear didn't last long. Anger started to rise. Humans are not made to sit quietly when harm comes to their own. Parents, engineers, teachers, and soldiers all felt it. A deep, burning need for justice. The colonies were not just remote outposts. They were pieces of humanity's dreams, its future. And now they had been stolen, burned, and erased. People refused to wait for explanations that might never come. This was no ordinary disaster. This was a massacre. At first, governments tried to coordinate. Reports were collected, emergency fleets were prepared, and international councils were convened. But nothing could hide the growing truth. Earth was on its own. The larger galactic community, which humanity had only recently joined, remained silent. The Galactic Council, the body meant to oversee interstellar peace, refused to act. They claimed the evidence was inconclusive. They asked for patience. They offered sympathy, but no protection. For the first time, humanity realized how small and vulnerable it was in a galaxy that didn't care. The silence from the galaxy forced people to confront something essential. If no one else would act, humanity had no choice but to act itself. And when that decision began to form, it didn't form in a government office. It formed in the hearts of ordinary people. Workers who had spent their lives maintaining ships. Engineers who had designed communication arrays. Scientists who had dreamed of exploring new worlds. All of them started asking the same question. What can we do? How do we stop this? Stories from the outer colonies slowly emerged, pieced together from fragments of data. People remembered the laughter in empty classrooms, the markets on distant moons, the simple joys of life in settlements so far from Earth. Each story told of life cut short, of dreams extinguished, and of a universe that had turned its back on them. These stories weren't just news reports. They were calls to action. Every citizen who heard them felt the same truth. Revenge wasn't just an option. It was a responsibility. Humanity owed it to those who were gone. Every night, people would watch the stars, wondering who could commit such atrocities. Speculation ran wild. Some thought it was a rogue alien faction, old enemies who had survived in hidden corners of space. Others believed it was a coordinated attack by a group that feared humanity's growth and influence. The truth didn't matter at first. What mattered was preparation. Humanity could not let this happen again. Every shipyard, every factory, and every research station became a hive of activity. Meanwhile, Earth itself changed. Ordinary life continued on the surface, but people were different. Farmers spoke of building ships, teachers taught their students how to think strategically, and pilots volunteered for missions they had never imagined. There was fear, yes, but there was also determination. People discovered strength they didn't know they had. The planet seemed to breathe a collective resolve. Humanity wasn't just surviving. It was awakening. For the first time in decades, people talked openly about war, not as something distant, something someone else fought, but as something that belonged to everyone. Conversations in coffee shops, classrooms, and even homes turned to strategy, survival, and tactics. Children who had never known a world without colonies learned about the lost settlements. They learned what it meant to fight for family, for friends, and for a future that others tried to steal. In their hearts, they carried the anger and hope of everyone who had been lost. And yet, even as humanity's anger grew, there was no chaos. People understood that this was bigger than them, bigger than any single city or nation. They knew that if they were to survive, if they were to respond effectively, they had to work together. Old rivalries were set aside. Disputes were replaced with cooperation. Humanity was learning to unite, not just as nations, but as a species. This unity, born from tragedy, became one of its greatest strengths. The first part of humanity's response was simple, almost symbolic. They would listen. They would study the attacks, gather every scrap of information, and find the patterns that could save the rest of the colonies and protect Earth itself. Scientists and analysts worked around the clock, combing through debris, decoding messages, and predicting enemy movements. Every small discovery felt like a victory. Every puzzle solved gave people hope. Humanity was no longer just a victim. It was learning to fight back in ways the galaxy had never expected. At night, when the stars shone brightly above the planet, people would look up and whisper the names of those who were gone. They imagined the laughter, the families, the markets, the schools, things that were stolen in a single day. They imagined a future where such things would be safe, not just on Earth, but across all the stars humanity now claimed as its own. The pain was deep, but the hope that burned alongside it was stronger. And in that hope, humanity found the seed of revenge, not blind or cruel, but precise, focused, and unstoppable. By the end of those first weeks, Earth had transformed. It was no longer a quiet, comfortable planet. It had become a hive of planning, learning, and preparation. People everywhere carried the same message in their hearts. Humanity would not bow. Humanity would not beg. Humanity would respond. The colonies had been massacred, but that loss would not define them. The stars were waiting, and humanity was ready to rise from the ashes of grief and anger to claim its place once more. The first part of the story was over, but the real journey was just beginning. Humanity had tasted fear, but now it was tasting determination. Every citizen, every worker, every child who looked to the sky knew one undeniable truth: revenge would ignite the stars. And this time, no one in the galaxy would be able to ignore it. The first part had ended with humanity shaken but determined. The loss of the colonies had planted anger and fear in every heart on Earth, but it had also awakened something else, a desire to understand who had done this and why. People could no longer live in ignorance. Every day, new information arrived from scattered sensors, distant probes, and fragments of communication left behind by the attacked colonies. It became clear that this was not an accident. Someone or something had planned these attacks with precision. As experts pieced together the evidence, a terrifying truth emerged. The signature of the weapons, the speed of the strike ships, and the paths they had taken all pointed to a faction humanity had barely heard of before, the Valtree Dominion. This ancient species had long been considered extinct, wiped out in battle centuries earlier. Yet here they were, alive and more dangerous than anyone could imagine. They had waited, hidden in the dark corners of the galaxy, and now they had returned to eliminate humanity before it could grow strong enough to challenge them. Earth's leaders convened emergency councils, but frustration quickly took over. The Galactic Council, a vast assembly of alien civilizations that oversaw disputes and conflicts, refused to take action. They claimed there was no proof strong enough to justify a response. They reminded Earth that rash actions could start a war and urged patience. Every word they spoke felt like a betrayal. Humanity had been attacked, innocent lives had been lost, and the larger galaxy, which humans had once believed would stand as allies, chose silence instead. That silence changed everything. Humanity realized that waiting for help would only cost more lives. If no one else would protect them, they had no choice but to protect themselves. Ordinary citizens began to take matters into their own hands. Engineers who had spent their lives designing ships began working on modifications that could turn ordinary vessels into fighting machines. Pilots who once carried tourists and cargo volunteered to patrol space, ready to defend what remained of humanity's colonies. Scientists turned their research labs into centers of strategy and innovation, looking for ways to counter a threat that the galaxy claimed did not exist. The revelation of the Valtree Dominion brought fear, but it also brought clarity. Humanity finally knew who they were facing. The Dominion's goal was simple and horrifying. They wanted to prevent humanity from rising, from claiming a place among the stars, from becoming a power that could rival them. The attacks on the colonies were not random. They were preventive, calculated to crush humanity before it could grow. Understanding this motive only fueled the anger that had been building on Earth. Families who had lost loved ones, teachers who had lost students, and workers who had lost friends shared their grief and anger openly. They began to demand answers, not just from their leaders, but from themselves. How could humanity survive against an enemy that the galaxy refused to acknowledge? How could ordinary people, living on a single blue planet, hope to fight a force that had existed long before humans even reached the stars? These questions were terrifying, but they also sparked determination. People refused to bow to fear. They refused to accept the idea that they were weak. As the days passed, humanity began to organize. Communication networks were strengthened, strategies were discussed, and plans were drafted in secret. There was no time for mistakes. Every action mattered. Every decision could save lives. Schools began teaching basic defense strategies. Civilian factories were converted into production centers for ships and equipment. Retired engineers returned to work, and students volunteered to assist in research and production. Everyone had a role, and for the first time, people felt the full weight of being part of the species that must defend itself. Despite the chaos, there were moments of quiet reflection. Citizens would walk through cities and look up at the stars, remembering the colonies that had been lost. They imagined the laughter of children who would never grow up, the families who had been torn apart, and the vibrant communities that had been erased in an instant. These memories were painful, but they were also powerful. They became the fuel for humanity's resolve. Anger alone would not save anyone, but when combined with purpose and skill, it became unstoppable. The first human missions into space, after the attacks, were careful and calculated. Scouts were sent to nearby sectors, mapping potential threats and searching for signs of the Valtree. Every ship was equipped with the latest technologies, and crews were trained to respond to sudden attacks. Even these small missions were dangerous. The Dominion had hidden traps, and some ships never returned. Yet with every challenge, humans learned something new. They adapted, improved, and grew stronger. The galaxy had underestimated them, and humanity intended to prove that mistake deadly. Meanwhile, stories of bravery began to spread. Pilots who had rescued entire crews, engineers who had repaired critical systems under fire, and civilians who had risked everything to save others became heroes. These were not legendary figures from centuries ago. They were ordinary humans who faced extraordinary circumstances and refused to give in. Their stories inspired others. Fear still existed, but it was accompanied by hope. Humanity was beginning to understand something essential. Survival required courage, unity, and intelligence. The government, realizing that conventional methods were not enough, began secretly developing advanced technologies. Hidden research facilities worked on faster ships, stronger defenses, and new communication systems. Every discovery, every prototype, every test was done with one goal in mind: ensuring humanity would never be caught off guard again. People began to see a future where Earth and its colonies could defend themselves, where humanity could finally stand on equal footing with other species in the galaxy at the same time. Humanity's anger took on a sharper edge. The loss of the colonies was not just a personal tragedy, it was a warning. The Valtree Dominion had shown that they could destroy entire human settlements without hesitation. This knowledge was terrifying, but it also made the resolve of humans even stronger. People began speaking openly about revenge, not in the sense of blind rage, but as a calculated, inevitable response. Humanity would not simply mourn its dead. Humanity would fight back. Every day, the human population seemed to grow closer, united by shared loss and shared purpose. Old rivalries between nations were set aside. Differences in language, culture, and politics mattered less than the fact that every human had lost something in the colonies. Communities that had once ignored each other began to cooperate. Scientists from different countries shared research freely. Engineers exchanged blueprints and designs. Pilots trained together, learning new maneuvers and tactics. For the first time in history, humanity was truly united not by treaties or politics, but by survival itself. The first messages to the remaining colonies were cautious but firm. Humans reached out, offering protection, guidance, and hope. They reassured survivors that they were not alone. The communication was more than strategic, it was human. People needed to know that even in the vastness of space, they had others who cared, who would fight for them, and who would not allow them to be abandoned at night. As Earth rotated beneath them and the stars stretched endlessly above, people whispered prayers, hopes, and promises. They promised to avenge the fallen. They promised to defend those still alive. They promised that humanity would survive, no matter the cost. And in that shared determination, something incredible began to happen. Fear and grief, though still present, started to transform into purpose. Humanity realized that it was capable of far more than it had ever imagined. The galaxy may have turned its back, and the Valtree Dominion may have thought humans were weak. But humans had learned their lesson. They were no longer simply a species trying to survive. They were a species ready to fight, to adapt, and to take back what had been stolen from them. The first part of this journey had been about loss, shock, and fear. The second part was about understanding, unity, and the first sparks of preparation. Humanity was ready to move from being victims to becoming a force the galaxy could not ignore by the end of this stage. One truth was clear: humanity would not wait for mercy. Humanity would not beg for protection. Humanity would rise, not out of hate alone, but out of necessity, courage, and the memory of all that had been lost. The stars that once seemed distant and cold were now a place of purpose. The revenge that would ignite the galaxy was beginning not in battle yet, but in the hearts and minds of every human who had looked up at the sky and sworn that this would not be the end. Humanity had found its enemy, understood its threat, and begun to prepare. The galaxy could watch, could doubt, could ignore, but humans would not falter. They had been attacked, they had been abandoned, and they had felt the full weight of loss. Now, they were learning to fight in ways the galaxy had never seen. And in that learning, in that preparation, humanity's true power was beginning to awaken. After understanding the threat of the Valtree Dominion, humanity realized that talking and planning alone would not be enough. They needed action. They needed strength. They needed to prepare for something the galaxy had never seen before: a united human fleet, ready to defend what remained of their species and reclaim what had been stolen. What had started as fear and grief now transformed into purpose, and Earth became the center of a vast mobilization unlike any in history. Every city, town, and community contributed in some way. Factories that once produced consumer goods were repurposed for building ships and weapons. Engineers and designers who had once worked quietly in laboratories were now leading entire fleets of human creativity. They invented new propulsion systems, stronger hull materials, and advanced communications tools. Every new design reflected human resilience. Machines that were fast, adaptable, and designed to survive attacks like those that had destroyed the colonies. But it was not only about machines. It was about people. Pilots, scientists, engineers, technicians, and even ordinary citizens became part of something greater than themselves. Schools taught basic survival and defense strategies. Universities ran accelerated programs to train ship commanders. Communities held workshops where anyone who wanted to contribute could learn to repair ships, operate sensors, or handle emergency protocols. Every human, from the youngest to the oldest, became part of the effort, realizing that survival was no longer a choice. It was a responsibility. The government coordinated massive recruitment campaigns. But the response was extraordinary. Thousands of volunteers arrived at shipyards and training centers, not out of coercion, but out of conviction. People had lost friends, families, and neighbors in the colonies, and every one of them carried the same determination. Humanity would not be destroyed quietly. They wanted to be part of the solution. Ordinary workers learned to pilot ships. Scientists became tactical advisors. Retired engineers returned to work, often putting in long hours to ensure that every machine was ready for the challenges ahead. Shipyards that had once been industrial centers for peaceful purposes now hummed with a sense of urgency. Steel, alloys, and advanced composites were shaped into hulls designed for speed and endurance. Engine rooms were reconfigured to produce maximum power for rapid maneuvers. Every ship was outfitted with sensors capable of detecting threats before they arrived, and weapon systems were designed for precision strikes. Human ingenuity, tested by survival instincts, produced vessels that were unlike anything the galaxy had seen. The construction of the fleet was accompanied by intense training. Pilots practiced evasive maneuvers and simulations that mimicked real combat. Crews drilled day and night to learn the coordination required for large-scale battles. Commanders studied every piece of intelligence available on the Valtree Dominion, trying to understand their tactics and weaknesses. Every success in simulation boosted morale. Every failure taught lessons that would save lives. Humanity was preparing not just for defense, but for the possibility of taking the fight directly to the enemy. Even as the fleet grew, so did the spirit of unity. Rival nations and factions on Earth put aside centuries of tension. Scientists shared discoveries openly, engineers collaborated across borders, and pilots trained together regardless of nationality. The idea that humanity could survive as a single, cohesive species became stronger every day. People realized that internal disputes could no longer exist. The threat was too great, the stakes too high. Earth was no longer a collection of nations, was one planet united in purpose. Alongside the technical and strategic preparation, there was a human side to the mobilization. Citizens sent messages of support to the families of volunteers. Communities built memorials for the lost colonies, reminding everyone why this effort mattered. Artists and writers created works that inspired courage and resolve. Musicians composed songs that were played in shipyards and training centers alike, reminding everyone that humanity's spirit could not be broken. Even in the midst of urgency, there was space for emotion, for connection, for the shared human experience that was driving the entire effort. The leadership on Earth recognized another truth: preparation alone was not enough. They needed intelligence, strategy, and foresight. Teams of analysts and scouts were sent to gather information on Valkyrie movements and strongholds. Every recovered fragment of communication, every piece of wreckage from the attacks, was studied meticulously. Patterns were identified. Weaknesses were discovered. Humanity learned that the Valkyrie were methodical and disciplined, but they underestimated adaptability and ingenuity, qualities humans had in abundance. Every small victory in understanding the enemy boosted confidence and strengthened resolve. Civilians, too, played a critical role. Volunteers constructed supply networks to ensure that the fleet could operate far from Earth without interruption. Engineers and scientists developed automated systems for repairs, maintenance, and logistics. Every part of society contributed to the war effort, not because they were forced, but because every individual knew that the survival of humanity depended on it. People began to understand a fundamental truth. Defense was not only the job of soldiers and pilots, it was everyone's responsibility. The fleet itself became a symbol of humanity's determination. Ships large and small, each uniquely designed, formed squadrons capable of rapid deployment and coordinated attack. Training exercises grew more complex every day. Crews learned to communicate silently, to anticipate each other's actions, and to adapt to unexpected situations. Humanity was not building a fleet to mimic others. They were building a fleet that reflected human ingenuity, resourcefulness, and creativity. Every ship carried the hopes of Earth, the memory of lost colonies, and the determination to survive. Communication between Earth and the fleet was carefully managed. Messages were encrypted and sent in bursts, ensuring that the Valkyrie could not intercept them. Humans learned to use silence as a weapon, hiding their movements, their numbers, and their intentions. Every strategy considered multiple scenarios. Every plan had a backup. Humanity could not afford mistakes. Every error could cost lives, and every victory could bring them closer to survival. At night, when the fleet rested in orbital hangars or docked in deep space stations, humans would look at the stars and remember the colonies they had lost. They thought of friends and family who would never return. They thought of the dreams that had been destroyed. And yet, in that memory, they found purpose. Grief transformed into determination. Fear became fuel. Humanity understood that their anger and loss were not weaknesses. They were the power that would drive them forward. The first missions of the fleet were cautious, testing new technologies and strategies. Small groups of ships patrolled nearby star systems, scanning for Valkyrie activity. Some encounters were frightening. Unexpected attacks forced human crews to improvise and adapt. Every encounter, whether successful or dangerous, was a lesson. Humanity learned quickly. The fleet grew stronger, faster, and smarter with each passing day. They were no longer just a collection of ships. They were becoming a single, coordinated force with a purpose that no one could ignore. Families on Earth followed the fleet closely. Messages from volunteers were shared across networks, keeping hope alive even as danger loomed. Communities celebrated every small victory, a successful patrol, a captured enemy probe, or a technological breakthrough. Humanity's morale became a force in itself, binding people together in shared determination and shared hope. Even in fear, there was courage. Even in grief, there was unity. As the fleet continued to grow, humans began to realize the true scale of what they were building. This was not merely a defensive measure. It was the first step toward taking the fight to the enemy. Humanity had been attacked, abandoned, and underestimated. Now, they were preparing to rise from the shadows, to show the galaxy that humans would not be destroyed, and to ensure that the memory of the lost colonies was honored through action. By the end of this stage, humanity had changed completely. Earth was no longer just a planet. It was the heart of a species ready to survive, fight, and reclaim its place among the stars. Every ship, every trained pilot, every volunteer, and every piece of technology was a part of this transformation. Humanity had learned that survival required courage, intelligence, unity, and relentless determination. And as the fleet grew, as strategies were refined, and as the first missions into deep space were prepared, one undeniable truth became clear. Humanity would not wait for mercy. They would take the fight to those who had massacred their colonies. The first part of this journey had been loss. The second part had been understanding the enemy and preparing minds and hearts. Now, in this third part, humanity was building strength, forging unity, and creating a fleet that would carry their determination across the stars. The galaxy had believed humans were vulnerable. They were about to learn just how deadly determination, creativity, and unity could be. Humanity was no longer simply reacting. They were preparing for the moment when they would strike back. And in that preparation, in every ship built, every crew trained, and every strategy refined, the first seeds of vengeance were planted. Humanity's revenge was not yet visible to the galaxy, but it was coming. It was coming in TH. The fleet had grown larger and stronger than anyone on Earth could have imagined just months before. Ships of all sizes, from sleek scout vessels to massive carriers, now orbited the planet and moved toward distant star systems where intelligence suggested the Valtree Dominion had bases. Every ship carried not just weapons and technology, but the memories of lost colonies, the grief of families, and the anger of millions who had been left powerless for far too long. Humanity was no longer waiting. They were ready to take action. The first strike was carefully planned. Commanders studied the enemy, analyzing patterns, calculating risks, and creating contingencies for every possible scenario. The Valtree had underestimated humanity, assuming they were weak, scattered, and unprepared. That assumption would cost them dearly. Human ships moved in silence, using stealth technology and deceptive flight paths to avoid early detection. Every crew knew that this mission was dangerous, possibly suicidal. But they also knew that action was the only path forward. When the fleet jumped into the star cluster where the Valtree strike forces were believed to be stationed, tension gripped every human aboard. Pilots ran through last-minute checks. Engineers monitored every system. Commanders coordinated movements with precision. The stars themselves seemed to hold their breath as humans prepared to confront an enemy that had once destroyed their homes. And then, without warning, they emerged. The first engagement was intense. The Valtree had anticipated attack from smaller forces, not a fleet this large, and their formations faltered under the speed and coordination of the human vessels. Pilots executed maneuvers no one had expected, striking at weak points in enemy defenses and avoiding attacks with precision. Engineers monitored shields and engines, ensuring that every ship could survive as long as possible. The battle was chaotic, loud, and terrifying, but humans adapted in real time. They were not merely fighting, they were learning, evolving, and exploiting every advantage. Communication between ships was critical. Teams had developed a system of silent signals and rapid codes that allowed them to coordinate without alerting the enemy. Every squadron knew its role, from flanking maneuvers to targeting enemy command vessels. Even the smallest ship could make a difference. Humans discovered that ingenuity, courage, and determination were as powerful as any weapon. Each strike weakened the enemy, not just physically, but psychologically. The Valkyrie had never faced a species that responded to fear with strategy, grief with courage, and loss with unity. The battle continued for hours. Ships dodged, attacked, and retreated in cycles, constantly adjusting to enemy moves. Explosions lit up the darkness of space. Debris floated between vessels, a reminder of the danger they faced and the lives lost in the colonies. Yet even as destruction unfolded, humans did not falter. Every maneuver was precise, every decision deliberate. Pilots pushed themselves beyond limits they had never thought possible. Engineers worked in shifts around the clock to keep weapons operational. Scientists monitored enemy patterns, predicting the next moves and advising commanders in real time. Humanity had transformed fear into mastery, and the results were visible. The first major victory came when a squadron managed to disable a Valkyrie carrier that had threatened several smaller human vessels. With the carrier immobilized, the humans quickly moved to capture it. Boarding teams faced extreme danger, but their training and preparation paid off. Inside the vessel, they discovered not just weapons and technology, but evidence of the Dominion's plans, documents, maps, and communications that revealed how deeply coordinated the attacks on the colonies had been. Humanity's understanding of their enemy grew with every victory, and with that knowledge came a new confidence. Despite the chaos of battle, moments of humanity shone through. Pilots risked their lives to save fellow crew members from damaged ships. Engineers repaired critical systems under fire. Medics worked tirelessly to keep injured crew alive. Even in the vastness of space, people cared for each other, their courage amplified by shared purpose. Each small act of bravery inspired others, creating a ripple of determination that could not be stopped. The psychological impact on the Valkyrie was immediate. They had expected humans to panic, to flee, to surrender under pressure. Instead, they faced a species that adapted faster than they could anticipate. Ships moved unpredictably, tactics changed mid-battle, and every human crew fought not only for survival, but for justice. The Dominion's confidence faltered. Their formations broke. Their communications were disrupted. Humanity had become more than a threat. They had become a force that could no longer be ignored. Commanders on Earth monitored the battle with a mixture of fear and pride. Every successful maneuver, every captured enemy vessel, was a sign that their preparation had worked. Yet they also knew the dangers were far from over. The Dominion was cunning, and one mistake could cost hundreds of lives. Commanders coordinated reinforcements, monitored supply lines, and ensured that humans could maintain the upper hand. The scale of the engagement was immense, but humanity's organization and unity kept them in control. By the time the first strike ended, the Valkyrie forces had suffered major losses. Entire squadrons had been disabled or captured, and the survivors were retreating in disarray. Humanity did not celebrate recklessly. They knew the battle was only the beginning. Yet a sense of pride and resolve swept through every human aboard the fleet. They had taken the fight to the enemy for the first time. They had proven that humanity would not be passive, and they had sent a message across the stars. Humanity was not to be underestimated. This message was not left to speculation. Broadcasts were sent through open channels, deliberately intercepted by Valkyrie communication systems. Human voices, calm but firm, announced their presence and resolve. They spoke of loss, of grief, and of justice. They reminded the Dominion of the colonies that had been destroyed and promised that humanity would not rest until those responsible had been held accountable. The broadcasts were not threats, they were warnings, deliberate and clear. Humanity had arrived in the galaxy as a force to be reckoned with. After the first engagement, crews spent hours repairing ships and treating the wounded. Engineers worked tirelessly to restore damaged systems, while medics cared for those who had been injured in combat. Even in the aftermath of destruction, humans showed care, resilience, and solidarity. They celebrated their successes quietly, knowing that the real work defeating the Dominion completely was still ahead. The battle had ignited a spark of hope and determination, and humanity's confidence in its ability to fight and survive had grown. Stories of heroism spread quickly among the fleet and back to Earth. Pilots who had saved entire crews, engineers who had kept critical systems functioning under fire, and medics who had saved lives against impossible odds became symbols of humanity's courage. Ordinary people had become extraordinary in the face of danger. Their actions inspired not just their fellow humans, but also observers in nearby systems who had doubted humanity's strength. The human spirit had proven resilient, adaptable, and unyielding. Even the Valtry began to reconsider their assumptions. They had believed humans were weak, disorganized, and slow to respond. They had assumed that humanity would crumble under pressure, just as their colonies had been destroyed. But now they faced a species that had transformed tragedy into strength, fear into strategy, and grief into determination. Humanity had not only survived, they had fought back and shown that they could strike with precision. Intelligence and courage dot as the fleet regrouped and prepared for future engagements. Humans reflected on the significance of the first strike. They had not only proven their capability, but also gained valuable knowledge about the Dominion's tactics and technology. Each battle, each maneuver, and each captured vessel became part of a growing understanding that would guide future operations. Humanity had moved from reactive defense to proactive strategy. The first strike had been both a test and a declaration. Humans would fight, and they would not be defeated. The memory of the lost colonies remained at the heart of every human aboard the fleet. Pilots whispered the names of friends and families as they flew. Engineers dedicated their work to those who had been lost, and commanders reminded every crew member that their actions were for justice. Humanity's revenge was no longer abstracted, it had become tangible, fueled by grief, anger, and the unyielding drive to protect what remained of their species. By the end of this first engagement, humanity had sent a clear signal to the galaxy. The Valtry Dominion had been challenged, and they had been shown that humans were far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. Humans had not only defended themselves, they had struck with precision, coordination, and courage. The first battle was over, but the war was only beginning. Humanity had taken the first step in a campaign that would reshape the stars and ensure that the memory of the lost colonies would never be forgotten. And as the fleet continued to patrol the star cluster, ready for the next encounter, every human aboard knew one undeniable truth. The first strike had been a warning, a lesson, and a promise. Humanity had arrived in the galaxy not as a victim, but as a force that would fight relentlessly, adapt continuously, and refuse to be defeated. The stars were no longer silent observers, they doubled. After the first strike against the Valtry Dominion, humanity's confidence grew, but so did their determination to understand the full scale of the threat. Captured ships, intercepted communications, and recovered intelligence provided a clearer picture of the enemy's plans. Humans discovered that the attacks on the colonies had not been random acts of aggression. They were deliberate, calculated, and motivated by fear. The Valtry Dominion had not attacked out of hatred alone. They had attacked to prevent humanity from ever rising to challenge them. The evidence was chilling. Detailed logs from captured ships showed that the Dominion had monitored Earth and its colonies for decades, tracking growth, technology, and the development of interstellar capabilities. Every colony that had been destroyed had been chosen strategically, not just for its resources, but for its potential to become a hub of human power. The Valtree had acted preemptively, trying to eliminate the threat before it could grow too large. Humanity realized that they had been under observation, studied, and judged by a species far older and more experienced in war. Learning this truth changed the mood across the fleet. There was anger, of course, but also clarity. Humanity now understood that the Dominion feared them, feared what they could become if left unchecked. This fear was evidence of human potential. If a species that had survived for centuries saw humanity as a threat, it meant humans had grown stronger, faster, and smarter than anyone had expected. The realization strengthened the resolve. Of every human aboard the fleet, they were not just survivors, they were a species capable of challenging the most dangerous forces in the galaxy. The news of the Dominion's motives spread back to Earth, sparking a wave of unity and determination among the population. People who had once doubted humanity's ability to respond now understood the stakes. Citizens volunteered in unprecedented numbers. Engineers, scientists, and workers contributed to the fleet, building ships, repairing systems, and developing new technologies. Families sent messages of encouragement to the fleet, and entire communities took on the responsibility of supporting the war effort. Humanity was mobilizing not just militarily, but culturally and socially. As the fleet continued its campaign, humanity also began to communicate with other species in the galaxy. Many civilizations had ignored Earth in the past, assuming humans were insignificant or too isolated to matter. But as word spread of humanity's successful strike and their resilience, the galaxy began to take notice. Some species, previously indifferent, reached out with cautious interest, offering intelligence, resources, or diplomatic support. Humanity had gone from being overlooked to being recognized as a force that could no longer be ignored. Even the Valtree began to feel the psychological impact of humanity's actions. They had assumed that humans would be passive, reacting only when attacked. Instead, humanity had not only defended itself, but had struck decisively, capturing ships, gaining intelligence, and demonstrating coordination and strategy that rivaled the Dominion's own forces. The fear they had hoped to inspire now worked against them. Humans were not merely fighting, they were learning, adapting, and gaining confidence with every encounter. The knowledge of the Dominion's preemptive motives also changed how humanity approached the war. Battles were no longer about revenge alone. They were about survival, justice, and ensuring that no other colonies would ever face the same fate. Commanders on Earth emphasized precision, strategy, and intelligence gathering. Pilots, engineers, and scientists all understood that each engagement was part of a larger plan. Humanity was fighting not just to win battles, but to change the course of the war and the galaxy itself. Inside the fleet, morale soared. The stories of heroism from earlier battles were shared widely. Pilots who had saved entire crews, engineers who had repaired critical systems under fire, and medics who had risked everything to save lives became legends. Their actions inspired others to push beyond limits they had never imagined. Each success built upon the last, creating a momentum that was impossible to stop. Humanity had transformed fear into action, grief into determination, and anger into strategy. The fleet also began to rebuild and strengthen the colonies that had survived or been partially damaged. Engineers and construction teams worked tirelessly to restore infrastructure, repair communications networks, and ensure that surviving populations were safe and self-sufficient. These efforts were not only practical, they were symbolic. Humanity was sending a message to the Dominion. Humans would not be eradicated, and they would rebuild stronger than before. The colonies became symbols of resilience and determination, rallying points for everyone fighting on Earth and in space at the same time. Humanity began sharing the truth about the Dominion's motives with the wider galaxy. Open channels broadcast evidence of the attacks, the premeditated destruction, and the systematic attempt to eliminate human colonies. These broadcasts were designed not only to inform, but also to inspire support. Species that had been indifferent or even hostile to humans began to reconsider. Some offered resources, some provided intelligence, and others simply acknowledged that humanity was a force to be respected. The galaxy could no longer ignore Earth, and the perception of humans shifted from weak newcomers to dangerous, determined survivors. Inside the fleet, humans reflected on the meaning of these discoveries. They realized that the Valtry's sphere was proof of humanity's potential. The Dominion had sought to eliminate humans not because they were cruel or malicious, but because they understood the threat humans represented. Humanity's growth, ingenuity, and adaptability had made them a target. But those very qualities, creativity, courage, and resilience, were now their greatest strengths. Each new engagement, each successful mission, reinforced the belief that humans were capable of shaping their own destiny, no matter the odds. This understanding also led to new strategies. Humans began using intelligence and deception more effectively, anticipating Dominion attacks and striking where the enemy least expected. They adapted quickly, learning from every encounter, and became more effective with each battle. Pilots coordinated with engineers and analysts in real time, using captured data to exploit weaknesses. Scientists developed new technologies that enhanced the fleet's capabilities, while commanders adjusted strategies based on lessons learned. Humanity was no longer reacting. They were leading, innovating, and taking control of the war. The impact on Earth was profound. Citizens watched as humanity's first victories and intelligence successes were broadcast. People who had once felt powerless now felt connected to a larger purpose. Communities organized support networks. Schools taught young people about the importance of preparation and strategy, and families encouraged one another to contribute in whatever way they could. Humanity was transforming into a species united by determination, grief, courage, and the desire to ensure that no one would ever be lost again. The discoveries about the Dominion also brought a moral clarity. Humanity realized that their fight was not only about survival, but about justice and the preservation of life. They were defending not just themselves, but the memory of the lost colonies, the hopes of surviving populations, and the principle that no species could impose its will through fear and destruction. This sense of purpose gave humans courage beyond measure. Each battle was not just a tactical engagement, it was a statement of identity, strength, and resolve. As the fleet continued its operations, the Valtry Dominion began to reconsider its assumptions. They had believed that humans were weak, disorganized, and incapable of coordinated strategy. They had assumed that once Earth's initial strike was met, humans would retreat. Instead, humans had not only fought back, but they had grown stronger, more determined, and more united with each engagement. The Dominion faced a species that learned quickly, adapted constantly, and refused to be intimidated. Humanity had become more than a threat. They had become a force that could reshape the balance of power in the galaxy. In the months that followed, humanity's reputation spread even further. Other species began to see Earth not as a vulnerable newcomer, but as a rising power capable of decisive action. The story of the lost colonies, the first strike, and the growing fleet inspired admiration and caution alike. Diplomats, strategists, and observers across the galaxy recognized that humans had turned tragedy into strength, fear into courage, and loss into determination. Humanity's revenge was no longer a secret. It was a growing force that others could not ignore. By the end of this phase, humanity had accomplished more than survival. They had uncovered the truth behind the Dominion's motives, gained invaluable intelligence, strengthened their fleet, and won the respect or fear of the wider galaxy. Every human aboard the fleet, every citizen on Earth, and every survivor in the colonies understood one undeniable fact. The attacks on humanity had awakened a species that would not be defeated, a people who had learned from loss and were now shaping their own destiny. The path ahead remained dangerous. The Valtree Dominion was still powerful, and the war was far from over. But humanity had discovered something more important than victory or defeat. They had discovered themselves. They were capable of courage, unity, intelligence, and innovation beyond what the Dominion had anticipated. They had turned green. After months of preparation, intelligence gathering, and small-scale victories, humanity was ready for the final campaign against the Valtree Dominion. The fleet had grown stronger, faster, and more coordinated than anyone could have imagined. Every ship carried not just weapons, but the determination, courage, and memories of millions of humans who had lost everything in the colonies. The time had come to take the fight directly to the heart of the Dominion. This was no longer a defensive mission. It was humanity's chance to reclaim the stars and ensure that the horrors of the past would never be repeated. As the fleet approached the outer reaches of the Dominion's territory, tension ran high. Commanders coordinated movements with precision, while crews ran through final checks of shields, engines, and weapon systems. Pilots tightened harnesses, engineers adjusted engines, and medics prepared for emergencies. Everyone knew the risks, but there was no hesitation. Humanity had been pushed to the brink before, and they had survived. Now, they were not only surviving, they were about to strike with purpose, skill, and determination. The Valtree, confident in their centuries of dominance, were unprepared for the scale and coordination of the human fleet. Humans had studied their tactics, learned from their previous engagements, and adapted their strategies. When the fleet emerged from hyperspace, they did so in a formation designed to maximize surprise and efficiency. Stealth ships infiltrated enemy lines, while larger vessels prepared to engage the Dominion's main forces. The element of surprise was humanity's greatest weapon. The first clash was fierce. Dominion ships fired relentlessly, but the humans had prepared for every scenario. Pilots executed maneuvers that tested the limits of their ships and themselves. Engineers maintained systems under extreme stress, repairing critical damage as quickly as it occurred. Scientists and analysts monitored enemy patterns in real time, adjusting strategies on the fly. Humanity's determination became their edge. Every human aboard the fleet knew that failure was not an option. They fought not just for survival, but for justice, for the memory of the colonies, and for the future of their species. As the battle escalated, humans began to gain the upper hand. Their coordination, adaptability, and ingenuity allowed them to exploit weaknesses in the Dominion's formations. Smaller, more agile ships struck at supply lines, while larger vessels targeted command centers. Boarding teams infiltrated enemy carriers, disabling weapons and gathering critical intelligence. The Dominion had assumed humans were reactive and predictable. They had underestimated the creativity, courage, and resilience of a species that had learned from loss and was now operating as one united force. Even in the chaos of battle, humanity's humanity shone through. Pilots risked their lives to rescue damaged ships and injured crews. Engineers worked tirelessly to restore systems under fire. Medics moved between vessels, saving lives and maintaining morale. Every act of courage, no matter how small, strengthened the fleet. Humans fought not only with weapons, but with intelligence, resourcefulness, and an unbreakable spirit. Every victory, every maneuver, and every act of bravery sent a clear message to the Dominion. Humans could not be destroyed. The turning point came when a squadron of humans managed to disable a major Dominion command ship. With their command structure compromised, the Dominion forces became disorganized and vulnerable. Human crews pressed the advantage, striking decisively at weakened positions. Ships that had once seemed invincible now faltered under coordinated attacks. Humanity's strategy, intelligence, and courage combined to create a force that the Dominion could not counter. The tide of the battle was shifting. Throughout the campaign, the human fleet maintained discipline and focus. Every move was deliberate, every attack calculated. The fleet's size, speed, and coordination allowed them to engage multiple targets simultaneously while minimizing their own losses. Communications were constant and efficient, enabling rapid adaptation to changes in the battlefield. Humanity's ability to learn and evolve in the midst of combat gave them an edge that the Dominion could not overcome. As the Dominion forces weakened, humans began to reclaim territories and colonies that had been lost. Teams of engineers and construction crews repaired infrastructure, restored communications, and ensured the safety of survivors. The colonies became symbols of resilience and hope, reminders that humanity could recover from even the most devastating attacks. Every recovered colony reinforced the fleet's determination, proving that loss could be transformed into strength and purpose. The psychological impact on the Dominion was profound. They had assumed humans were weak, reactive, and incapable of coordinated strategy. Instead, they faced a species that had transformed tragedy into determination, fear into skill, and loss into a driving force for survival and revenge. The Dominion's confidence faltered as their forces were systematically dismantled. Humanity was no longer a minor nuisance. They were a dominant, intelligent, and unstoppable force. Back on Earth, citizens followed the final campaign with intense anticipation and pride. Families of volunteers, communities supporting the fleet, and survivors of the colonies all watched as humanity took control of its destiny. Stories of heroism, sacrifice, and strategy spread quickly, inspiring people to continue contributing to the war effort in any way they could. Earth had become not just a base, but the heart of a species united by courage, determination, and the desire for justice. As the final engagements unfolded, humans discovered more evidence of the Dominion's plans. They found that the attacks on the colonies had been only part of a larger scheme to control or eliminate any emerging civilizations in the galaxy. This knowledge only strengthened humanity's resolve. They were not fighting only for themselves. They were fighting to ensure that no species would ever be targeted so ruthlessly again. Every victory was a step toward reshaping the galaxy, not just for humans, but for all intelligent life. The final battle was a combination of strategy, courage, and innovation. Humans used everything they had learned from intelligence, training, and past encounters to execute maneuvers that the Dominion could not predict. Pilots coordinated attacks on multiple fronts, while engineers maintained critical systems under extreme pressure. Boarding teams disabled key vessels, and scientists monitored the flow of the battle, adjusting tactics in real time. Every human played a role, and the unity of purpose made the fleet unstoppable. By the end of the final engagement, the Dominion was decisively defeated. Many of their ships were destroyed or captured, and their command structure had been dismantled. The survivors retreated into distant corners of the galaxy, forced to reconsider the threat posed by humanity. The colonies were safe, and the human fleet returned to Earth victorious, not as a collection of ships and technology, but as a testament to the courage, intelligence, and determination of an entire species. The aftermath of the campaign was as important as the battles themselves. Humans rebuilt the lost colonies, established stronger defenses, and created networks of support to ensure that no settlement would ever be left vulnerable again. Scientists shared knowledge, engineers improved technology, and communities celebrated the resilience and bravery that had carried humanity through the darkest times. The galaxy began to recognize Earth not just as a planet, but as a rising power capable of defending itself and shaping the course of interstellar events. The victories also had a profound impact on human society. People realized that they were capable of far more than they had imagined. Fear had been transformed into courage, grief into determination, and loss into strength. Humans had learned to work together as a species, using intelligence, creativity, and empathy to achieve what many thought impossible. The campaign had changed humanity, not just in the galaxy, but in how people saw themselves. They were no longer just a vulnerable species. They were leaders, innovators, and defenders. Stories of heroism and resilience became legends. Pilots who had saved entire crews, engineers who had repaired critical systems under fire, and medics who had risked their lives to save others were celebrated across the colonies and Earth. These stories inspired a new generation of humans, teaching that courage, intelligence, and unity were the true weapons of survival. The memory of the lost colonies, once a source of grief, now became a symbol of the human spirit and determination as humanity looked to the stars. They realized that their journey had changed them forever. The galaxy had once seen humans as weak and unremarkable. Now, humans were a force to be reckoned with, capable of defending themselves, reclaiming what was lost, and shaping the future. The campaign against the Valtree Dominion had shown that humans could rise from tragedy, adapt to unimaginable challenges, and achieve victory through unity and intelligence. The story of humanity's revenge and survival became a legend, not just on Earth, but across the stars. Survivors of the colonies rebuilt, young humans trained in the ways of defense and exploration, and societies flourished with the knowledge that they were capable of extraordinary things. Humanity had ignited the stars not through conquest alone, but through resilience, courage, and the refusal to be defeated. By the end of the campaign, one truth was clear. Humanity had changed the galaxy forever. The Valtree Dominion, once feared as unstoppable, had been defeated. See,